Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, Everything is Health, a knowledge translation podcast with Maddie and Nick. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. Today's Learning Circle will be exploring Everything is Health, a knowledge translation podcast with Maddie and Nick. I'll ask our guests to introduce themselves in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Serene Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle manager. I am Teal Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. And I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kira, our production assistant. They will be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point you feel that you need to talk to an elder, friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our guests to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Maddie, and I'm a mixed settler and Indigenous ancestry. So my dad's family is Tsimshian from Lac Kw'alaams, northern coastal BC, and British. And my mom's family settled on Prince Edward Island all the way out east. So I grew up in Toronto, and I moved out here for my undergrad degree like 7 years ago now, and I've been here since. And I'm zooming in from the Point Grey area, so the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. And I'll pass it over to Nick.
Thanks, Maddie. So my name is Nick. I use him pronouns. I'm a community librarian at the UBC Learning Exchange. I'm also joining today from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. I am a settler Canadian of Dutch, Irish, and Scottish backgrounds. I grew up on KC, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo territories in Surrey. I think just to kind of bring it back to my sort of role as a librarian, a lot of my work has really focused on rethinking Western knowledge systems and the ways in which we can enable inclusion of a range of Indigenous and other kinds of perspectives in all of the stages of knowledge creation and sharing. And I'm also a co-host of the podcast that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Maddie, did you want to introduce the podcast itself?
Yeah, and I guess I forgot to mention that I'm in my second year of medicine now at UBC, and so that's kind of how this project got started. In medicine, they have this, like at UBC, they have this wonderful program where you're supposed to do kind of a project outside of school called the Flex Project. And so I think I emailed Dr. Towle at the UBC Learning Exchange where Nick works, and I actually applied for a job there. I applied for WorkLearn, and got totally shut down. She said basically, like, you're not gonna have the time. I don't know why you're applying for this. Like, did you realize you just started medical school? And I realized she probably knew what she was talking about because she used to be the director of the UGME like medical program at UBC. So I was like, okay, like, thank you so much for the guidance. And she suggested that I do a Flex project with the UBC Learning Exchange, and so she put us in touch. Nick and Matt and I, and you guys suggested starting a podcast. I think originally I said, like, absolutely not. There's no way we're doing that. But like, we got to know each other a bit better. Sorry. And yeah, I feel like we just hit it off, and it seemed like the right decision to go forward with the project, even though it was kind of outside of all of our comfort zones. So we ended up settling on this idea of doing a knowledge translation podcast, because I guess partially because of your work with the Making Research Accessible initiative and like our kind of shared interest in the social determinants of health. Do you want to say a bit about kind of the Learning Exchange and the Making Research Accessible initiative, Nick?
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you're saying is totally right. Just having some of those conversations together about where we had interests and some backgrounds. I'd never made a podcast before, but I have some background working with audio production with music, and I helped host a radio show previously. So I had a bit of that experience, as well as some of the work I've been doing with the MRAI around clear language versions of research findings, that kind of thing. But I think that in those conversations, again, we just hit it off and sort of realized that there was this opportunity for us to try something a little bit new that would be not only hopefully like a great learning opportunity for Maddie, but for us and for me as well. I think that was totally true. But it also aligned with our goals with the Making Research Accessible initiative. So to kind of step back again to introduce the Learning Exchange and the Making Research Accessible initiative. The Learning Exchange is UBC's community engagement unit in the Downtown Eastside of Vancouver. And it's been operating in that community and working alongside community members since 1999. Really intended to be a shared place-based sort of venue for folks from the Downtown Eastside community, as well as the university community, to connect, share, and really learn from each other. It's kind of suggested by the name itself, Learning Exchange. And so we have a long history of providing low barrier community programming in technology, English conversation, cultural programming, a variety of these kind of things. And over the years, folks working at the Learning Exchange had heard from community members that there's a lot of research that happens in the Downtown East Side, but it tends to be very extractive. Researchers come in sort of with an idea about what they'd like to do. They might work with community members and kind of gather knowledge expressed by people from their lived experience or their other expertise that they might have. Take away those findings, publish them in an academic paper that ends up behind a paywall. And that might be the last that community members hear from a researcher. And so there's a lot of frustration about that. Sort of studies would get repeated. People were unable to access and make use of these research findings built on their knowledge. And so the Making Research Accessible initiative really sort of takes its cues from what community members have been saying about this extractive research sort of cycle that's been ongoing for years. And so there's a real intent to disrupt that extractive research cycle. And one of the ways that we focused on doing that is by creating something called the Downtown Eastside Research Access Portal. And the main feature of that portal is it's a collection of academic articles written about or relating to the Downtown Eastside, community created materials that we host. But I think where the podcast comes in is another big component of that portal, is more accessible, clear language research product. So we have a long-standing collaboration with an art studies class to create infographics that are quite popular that we also have up in our space and use in community programming. We've done some workshops on clear language writing and sort of translating research articles in that way. And we were really curious about trying other kinds of formats, video and audio in this case, to sort of see whether that's something that would help address that interest from community members in having more accessible sort of research products. And so we kind of conceptualized this project as a way to address that and sort of help us work towards that goal. Yeah, I don't know, did I miss anything about sort of our thinking there, Maddie?
No, I think you got everything there. Yeah. And
sorry, and I just to add, I think that the sort of the kind of conversational tone that we ended up kind of striking with the podcast was a really important part of that. You know, not just kind of you know, having one of us read through some clear language translation of the findings, but to have a conversation about the research that's out there, and in having a conversation, create sort of a you know, audio space that's a little bit more inviting and easier for folks to kind of connect to in some way.
Yeah, and that was really fun to script as well, because I mean, Nick was like so patient and kind, and I would like write him the most ludicrous things to say because we kind of scripted it, and he really played along, which was was really nice. And so you'll hear him just say like absurd things at points in the podcast, but it's stuff that we really wanted to cover. And yeah, I really appreciated that.
Yeah. I like to joke about how it's the role I was born to play of sort of useful idiot. But why don't we kind of step back a little bit? I'm wondering if Maddie, you could share a little bit about how we had decided that we wanted to do this podcast, and we had some thoughts about generally that we wanted to talk about social determinants of health in the Downtown Eastside. We knew we wanted it to have sort of those conversational formats. Maybe you could talk through how we decided what sort of topics we wanted to cover in the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. Like, we weren't trying to make a podcast explicitly about Indigenous health, but we ended up like talking a lot about different topics that related to Indigenous health. So I think in that way, it really kind of like factored in a lot of our interests, our personal interests. But we also wanted to make the podcast, I think, as useful as possible to community members and organizations, and kind of like conceptualizing this as like, how can we strengthen the relationship between community and the academy by like giving back what is rightfully communities from the academy's, literature. And so, yeah, we tried to pick things that would be relevant and of use to community members and organizations. And I think we started doing this by like going through the research access portal's usage data, and we tried to find topics that were searched for the most, and then also ones where like the amount of content available was disproportionately low compared to the interest in those topics. So you could see like the number of searches and then the number of articles. And then we presented like kind of a draft of the project or the ideas to the Urban Core Committee, which is this network of organizations and nonprofits operating on the Downtown East Side. And just to get feedback like on what topics they thought would be most useful or they'd most like to see covered. And so I think that was a big part of kind of getting the topics figured.
And I think we were kind of surprised that, maybe not surprised, but you didn't really get a universally warm reception at that first meeting.
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh, no. That was a big learning experience for me. But I think it goes back to like what you were saying about this. There's such a fraught history of like the research relationship between UBC and the Downtown East Side. So I found even like the first sentence I said, I think I mentioned the word research, and I think it can just be a triggering word in and of itself in some contexts. And I think like out of the gate, we got a lot of like really good constructive feedback. And I think we were both coming at the project from this like very academic perspective. You have some community ties to the Downtown East Side with your job, but I really don't, like beyond volunteering and stuff. And I was like really hyper aware going into this project. I think that there was like so much potential to perpetuate harm, even if we were trying to do good with the project and trying to like we had the best intentions. But I think like, yeah, we were very aware that because of our positionalities, like there was just so much potential for harm, and we couldn't assume that everything we were doing was going to have positive effects. I guess, yeah, all this is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Yeah, I think just to pick up on that too, like I think a lot of folks and organizations in the Downtown East Side have that experience of like a really well-intentioned student or researcher coming in and having these big ideas about like, I want to make these contributions or support the community in this way. There's this sort of like well-earned skepticism, I think, on behalf of community members of like anytime somebody new is coming in and kind of like throwing around big ideas. And like you said, it's not only kind of like that level of trust and credibility, but also like, yeah, if you get something, it could perpetuate some stigma about the Downtown East Side that's all too common in the ways in which this neighborhood is talked about in the media, and sort of particularly for kind of people and audiences who aren't part of the community. So I think it was kind of really building some of that trust around that we wanted to do something that would really reflect those community perspectives, have a bit of a critical eye to the research, and and also that we really intended to create something that would be useful to those who are not Downtown Eastside community members, but really focused on supporting organizations and people in the Downtown Eastside itself, and really centering that as one of our goals. But I think what we ended up doing is kind of like following up with some folks and being able to have some conversations that I think were really beneficial for us to hear about how we could ensure that we could sort of fulfill what we set out to do, but also to build some of that credibility and trust with some of the people who were a little bit more critical or had concerns about what we were proposing.
Yeah, I feel like we really benefited from like the willingness of people to like give us feedback early on and like not hold back and like put time in to build relationships with us. Like it was very generous. And I think like I remember at one point, like a week into the project, I was like, Nick, I don't think we can do this project, but you kind of calmed me down, and then we had like some great meetings with community members and different folk, and like I think figured out like how to get the project off the ground in a good way. And then I think that like reflexivity was really essential to the project even happening in the first place, because I think we were both like very apprehensive about some aspects of it. But I guess back to the topics, like we ended up settling on low barrier employment, housing first initiatives, and safe supply, which were kind of the topics that came out on top. If I remember correctly, like out of the urban core committee, they were like the top 3 ranked topics.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because those topics and that kind of like the way we sort of focus those episodes sort of reflects proposed solutions to respective challenges in the community of like, unemployment, houselessness, the drug poisoning crisis. And it was kind of interesting to sort of realize as we were doing the podcast that were really framed around solutions and not problems. And that orientation, I think, was really important for us in how we were able to talk about this research taking place in the community, and sort of how the results of some of that research might be used to support some of these solutions and broaden their implementation and as interventions to support folks living in the Downtown Eastside.
That's a good point, because I feel like it kind of reminds me of like the community-based research guidelines, or how the last step of like in theory the community-based research paradigm is action. And I feel like I like the idea that like we were trying to focus on kind of like next steps, or like how can this research serve people, and not just like the furthering of people's careers within the academy. Like what is this going to look like going forward? That's a good point.
Yeah, so focusing on kind of those outcomes and what we're hoping this will be enabling in one way or another. And you touched on this before, but we've said already that like no one specific episode was like explicitly focused on Indigenous health. But just to bring the question back to you, does this feel like a podcast about Indigenous health to you?
Yeah, I think it really did to me. Like, but I think it speaks to like the biases that we're all bringing to, everything we do. But I felt like it just kept circling back to Indigenous health throughout the podcast. And I think at one point, like I even said, it's impossible to make like a podcast about the social determinants of health in Vancouver without talking about Indigenous health. And that was like, I think it was one of the big reasons why the podcast like felt like such a personal project, I think, for both of us. But
and I think we talked, I think we both to at least some extent tried to bring as much of our whole selves in an honest sort of way into the podcast, and that can be really vulnerable, but I think it's really like how can you not when you're talking about some of these things. And I would hope too that like doing that is a way to kind of like surface where we're coming from and really recognize and reflect on that perspectives, or those perspectives that we have. I wouldn't feel comfortable talking about some of the things that we talked about without doing that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it meant that we got to know each other a lot better, I think, than you normally do, like through a school project.
Mhm.
Felt like we had to like know ourselves, know each other in order to make the podcast because they're such personal topics.
Yeah, and sort of that relationship building we did, I think, was really critical to us being able to do this podcast and really important in that process. I wanted to ask if you had a favorite episode out of the five that we produced.
Definitely. Yeah, actually, I feel like that's a good segue because it's kind of like, I think episode 3 was my favorite for sure. I think because I felt like it was the one that I brought the most of myself into. In episode 3, we talked about like the connection between colonization and houselessness, and specifically like the effect of exposure to residential schools on the likelihood of experiencing houselessness and the connection through exposure to child welfare, and specifically like data relating to Vancouver.
Did you want
Yeah,
to talk about, there was that one specific study that really laid that out very clearly. Do you
yeah,
want to mention that one?
yeah. I can mention that one. I I think that was a cool moment for me because it felt like kind of bringing. I was like so excited. I remember to make this episode, because it felt like seeing knowledge in. Well, I'll mention what the article was first. So there was this 2019 study by Brittany Barker, where they looked at like the relationship between someone's familial residential school system exposure and their likelihood of currently being involved with the child welfare system, and specifically among people who use drugs in Vancouver. And they found this like really powerful generational effect. So what I mean by that is like, if your grandparent went to residential school, you're about 1.5 times as likely to yourself be in child welfare. And if you have a parent who went to residential school, you're twice as likely to be involved in child welfare. So it's like generation by generation. And the really interesting point that they made was that for Indigenous people with no family exposure to residential school, you're not at any increased risk of involvement with child welfare relative to non-Indigenous people. And I just like it really, reading that article like really struck me, because I felt like it was this like really clear example of how exposure to colonialism is a risk factor for these negative outcomes that affect your health. And it's not like being Indigenous is not a risk factor. It's like the exposures. And I often find in med school, like we don't talk about that enough. It's often you see these slides that are like, oh, if your patient's Indigenous, like screen them for this, but it's not. I think it really should be like, if your patient was exposed to like a colonial genocide, maybe screen them for this, and I think there's like, can be a lot of harm in kind of like skipping over what the actual causative agent is in that, and kind of like generalizing and just saying, because you get really close to just saying like being Indigenous is a risk factor for things. And I think that can be very harmful. And then I think like seeing this article in print, like in a scientific article was really exciting to me, because I think this is the kind of knowledge that like a lot of Indigenous people have and like are living every day, but there's something special about like seeing it validated in this like knowledge system that has systematically ignored it for so long. So yeah, it was really cool to see, and at like baby steps, I guess.
Yeah, and that must have, like, I think we've talked about this a lot so far, but sort of had that personal connection for you and kind of hit home in some way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like that was such a tricky part of the podcast because like I really wasn't sure like how much of myself to bring into it. Like partly because it's not easy to talk about, but then also because like our intended audience was community, and a lot of people have like lived experiences similar to mine with family or personal exposure to residential schools. And I think sometimes it can be hard to like listen to stories that are reminiscent of your own and like triggering. And I didn't want it to be like harder emotionally than it needed to be for other like First Nations community members. an activist to like listen to our podcast. I didn't want it to be like, I think it's asking a lot of someone to like listen to stories sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's, we had a lot of conversations about this and kind of wrote and rewrote things. And there was this sense I thought of like feeling like this is important to talk about, but we wanted to be very careful about how we talked about it. Maybe you could share a little bit about how you kind of worked through some of those considerations that we had about talking about this kind of thing.
Yeah. And yeah, it was funny because I think like we did write and rewrite. And then I remember you saying like, well, why don't we just record something and you can always cut it out and we can always re-record it. And I think that was helpful, like having control of the editing and stuff. Like I felt like even when we were sitting down to record that episode, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to feel comfortable putting this out there. And you were like, well, that's okay. Like you can always edit it. You can always re-record it. There's no pressure. And I think that was like feeling that support from you. Like I just felt totally comfortable, which I think was really helpful. But yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to Elder Roberta Price about it, specifically about episode 3 and like these concerns. And that was really helpful. And I remember, I don't know if you know Elder Doris Fox, but she also works with UBC a fair amount. And she once told me about how, and it wasn't in this context, it was like a totally different project. She was telling me how, stories have like a beginning and a middle and an end. And you do them a disservice to only tell the middle or the end. And in the context, I think, of making this podcast with you, for me, that meant like really bringing our whole selves into it. Like we were talking about earlier, like both in the creative aspects, like, you making the music and me making the cover art, but also in the content. Like, if this podcast is the middle of a story, like what's the beginning? Where did we come from? And why are we doing this? And I think that's where, like, for me, it was really important to bring in like my true motivations for making this podcast. Like, why do I like always want to talk about residential schools? Like, why is that so important to me to like bring it back to the root causes? I think in order to be genuine, in order to like convey the meaning of the story, like we had to include some of the beginning. And then I think the end is like, yeah, where are we going from here?
And I think we talked a lot about that, like the perspectives and things that we each wanted to kind of focus in on or continually kind of revisit in some way or another, and that perspective and your perspective is a strength that you brought to this work. And even though sometimes living in your own perspective can feel like it's limiting in some way, it is also that strength that you're bringing to this sort of work. But sort of coming back to that story, or that thing that you mentioned that Elder Doris Fox was talking about, sort of the nature of beginnings, middles, and ends of stories. It kind of brings me back as well to thinking about what you were saying earlier about Indigenous knowledge and experiences being, in more recent years, more affirmed in Western academic literature, which gives a little bit of a sense of hope that like these, as far as like scholarly publishing and that kind of thing, those sort of perspectives are beginning to shift, and that sort of knowledge is being better recognized. But there's also the question of like, where are we in that story? Even as far as health interventions and those kind of things go, I heard at a conference in the spring on community engagement that best practices in medicine take on average 17 years to move from the literature to what's routinely done in the field. And it can be really hard in the face of so much like oppression and suffering to not see change happening as fast as it should be, or as you might like it to.
Yeah, I think I've read that stat too, or maybe they like mentioned it in lecture at some point, and it is dispiriting. I think it also like motivates the whole knowledge translation thing, right? It's like, why do we care about moving knowledge quickly? And I think it's because it's like an ethical concern. It's like you can't do the research if you don't plan on translating it, in my mind. And people obviously feel differently about that, but yeah, I feel like I think that stat is like a great example of why we felt like knowledge translation is important, and kind of, yeah, motivating podcast.
And that 17 years isn't like an immovable object. It's kind of how things typically are.
Yeah.
But that's what we'd like to see change, really.
Did you have a favorite episode, Nick, of the pod?
Yeah, we've already talked a lot about episode 3, so that probably would have been my choice, but I can talk about another one. I think probably episodes 4 and 5. We kind of did a few episodes like this where there was like a part 1, part 2. And those episodes really focused on harm reduction and safe supply. And I think I picked those ones because I certainly found them the most challenging. I have some familiarity with overdose prevention and other approaches like these kind of on the ground, but I'm not very familiar with the scientific literature related to substance use. And particularly as somebody who has sort of an arts background and is a librarian, like I'm not a scientist. I felt quite a bit out of my depth at times as we were kind of working through preparing the material, and Maddie was sharing with me sort of like these summaries of studies she'd been reading. And then I sort of remembered or was reminded that, that sort of non-expert perspective in the context of this podcast is really like an asset that I have to help me kind of ask the questions that others who aren't substance use researchers might also want to ask, and kind of think about how we're framing and talking about the results of those studies in a way that will be understandable and comprehensible to people who aren't substance use researchers. I also felt like at that point of kind of having recorded 3 other episodes before that, certainly my confidence was growing in terms of our ability to tackle sort of these more complex and challenging topics. But initially, we certainly like hesitated about whether we should talk about substance use at all, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and it just reminds me, I don't know if you remember this, but like I'd written up this like summary of a couple of studies, and I had you kind of explaining them or asking some question, and you were trying to pronounce the words of all the like scientific names of all the I think it was like the injectable opioid agonist treatments.
Mm-hmm.
And we just kept like re-recording it because they were just words you'd never like had to speak aloud before. And I remember like you were getting frustrated, and then eventually we were like, oh well, maybe it's okay if you mispronounce them. Like that's kind of part of this whole thing, is like a lot of the literature is inherently like inaccessible, and maybe that's okay to show in our recording. We don't have to like record this 10 times until you say all the words perfectly. It's kind of part of the whole thing that like these words they look very similar. It's very jargony, and that is part of what makes the literature inaccessible. So I don't know, I just remember that moment like in the studio being like, okay, maybe we don't have to make the podcast perfect, and maybe it can like reflect our process as well of trying to understand the literature.
Yeah. And that reminds me too of there's this sort of anecdote that Jim McLeod, who is one of the co-authors of the Research 101 Manifesto, which is community-created guidelines for ethical research practices in the Downtown Eastside. It's a great read if anybody would like to check it out at some point. But I've seen him, or kind of heard him share this several times, this story of he was sort of trying to read through this academic paper, and the authors had described a tree as, quote, exhibiting marked verticality. So the tree was tall. And, certainly in the scientific literature, there is a need sometimes to use very specific terms and to be specific and provide the level of detail that's required. But it can be just as easy to fall into some of these traps around sort of inflating the kind of language that's used. And so, I think with this knowledge translation, it's like, well, let's deflate it and make it easier for everybody to kind of to grasp and to kind of work through. So, yeah.
That's a good example. That's really funny. But yeah, I guess I'm just like back to that. You were asking like about you're mentioning that we kind of hesitated with making those episodes in the first place, which I think it's interesting that then those you're saying are like some of your favorite episodes to make, because I think we were so nervous about making episodes about the drug poisoning crisis, because it's obviously like such a sensitive topic and so out of our wheelhouse. Like I think, we just don't neither of us were bringing like a lived experience to those episodes. And like we'd both listen to, so much incredible content created by people with lived and living experience. Like we talked a lot about the Crackdown podcast, and that we didn't, and I think in some ways like the Crackdown podcast was such an inspiration, I think in some ways for this project, but we also didn't want to like pretend that we were creating anything even like vaguely similar or attempting to create something similar to like what Garth Mullins is doing with the Crackdown podcast, because we're just not coming at it from that positionality. So I don't know, I was like apprehensive about making those episodes, but I definitely like, learned so much, probably partially because it felt like so sensitive. We had to be so intentional, I think, about what we were doing there.
Yeah, and ultimately it felt like it was an important thing. We couldn't really avoid talking about it at this stage, in terms of topics that were relevant to interests from community members, but also just like very clearly expressed in the sort of social determinants of health literature. So it just felt important enough, and we felt like we could approach it in a way that would be sensitive and not claiming to be, we wouldn't be claiming to be authoritative kind of sources on that topic. Sort of speaking of topics, I'm wondering if there's any topics that you wish we talked about more on the pod, or like if we were doing another 3 episodes right now, like, what would you want to focus on?
I think that's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind, I think we touched on it, but we didn't go into a lot of depth on it, are kind of the more positive social determinants of health, especially like relating to Indigenous people in BC. Like I think there's really obvious positive social determinants of health that Indigenous people stand to benefit from, and we really focused on these like really negative social determinants of health, which I think in some ways is problematic or like bugs me when I see that, because I think it's like a deficit-based lens, I guess. And like for example, I would have loved to have talked about Indigenous cultural identity as a protective factor in health outcomes. And my supervisor at U of T, Dr. Ashley Quinn, she does a lot of research on this. And maybe we can like link it somewhere. I don't know. Maybe we can like add I don't know, to the webinar or even to the podcast description, or just like it'd be nice to get some of that kind of more positive strengths-based research out there, translated as well. How about you though? Was there anything for you that stuck out?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you like that. I think that was certainly something that like, I think as we were in the process of recording these episodes, we kept thinking like, oh, this would be great to go more into this. And we kind of set sort of ourselves up to talk about the topics that we did. And do our best again to focus sort of on what are some of the solutions and assets related to those challenges. So as much as in some respects, like, our episode about housing is addressing sort of houselessness, it is focused on kind of like what sort of interventions could be helpful and what can we build on. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything I wish we had done instead, but there's so much more we could talk about. And I have like a little sort of note on my phone that I kind of kept running more or less the whole time we were working on this podcast, just listing other things that would be great to touch on. So I had like food sovereignty, arts, leisure, green spaces, climate resiliency. Like there's so many different things like that. I think one of the challenges of some of those topics is that they aren't necessarily researched in the same kind of depth as some of the other things that we talked about. But I think we could kind of, with a bit of digging, figure something out with each of those. We also heard a lot of really interesting ideas for other topics sort of at our launch events that we held at the Learning Exchange on October 4th.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the launch run? I feel like that was such a fun part of the whole process.
Yeah, so with a bit of support from a grant from UTown, we hosted, it's about 30 or 35 people at the Learning Exchange, community residents, frontline workers, medical professionals, executive directors, researchers, and students. So a really interesting mix of people who have an interest in this area. And really invited them in to listen to the podcast and discuss it and kind of share their own kind of perspectives about the topics that we were discussing. So we had Elder Roberta Price, who provided an amazing welcome and hung out with us and spoke with folks throughout the session, and provided some food and invited folks to sort of circulate around different listening stations we'd set up with short clips of the episodes, like 1 or 2 minutes each. And then we put these big dishes on the wall with questions related to the clip they just heard, like, for the clip that kind of explains, for those who are familiar, like, what is social determinant of health? What are some other important social determinants of health? I think that was what I was kind of getting at with the, what we were hearing from community members and other folks about that. Like what makes a house a home, for example. And so, yeah, we asked them to sort of write their responses on sticky notes and paste them onto these big sheets, which is really, people seemed very engaged. We had tons of responses, which is super cool to sort of see what people had to say about that. And I also think that, it's just really exciting to have that opportunity, especially kind of after 2.5 years of sort of being in pandemic mode, to really bring together in person over food, like this really diverse group of people, to be able to kind of speak with each other, because in a lot of cases, like, people stay within their kind of silo and there's not enough communication across those different groups who all kind of have a stake in these topics. So yeah, just that alone, I think it was just really dynamic and honestly, like, very encouraging to just witness people from these different backgrounds kind of connecting and engaging around some of these topics.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like, I think as a student, it was cool too, because there's so much hierarchy, I think, within like academia. There's, you're a student, you're an undergrad, you're a grad student, you're a postdoc, you're a researcher, you feel this like intense hierarchy. And I think it's like coming together over food in an informal setting is a way, I think, of like, and I know this is not an original thought, of like breaking down hierarchies. And so like some of the conversations I had were like just so cool. It felt like such a positive experience, like as a student, to see researchers and community members like who all care about the same topics, like coming together in the same space, I guess, in a way that I've never, like, I don't know, I guess I did a lot of basic science research in my undergrad, and I never had that kind of experience of feeling like research had purpose in a community setting, and that both like researchers and community members were like showing up to build those relationships. I thought that was cool. And then it was also nice to feel like a couple people had like listened to the podcast, or like after we'd spent so much time and effort making it. I think it was cool to feel like, oh, okay, at least a couple people are going to listen to this thing. And and the sandwiches were good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was really interesting to just see some of the positive response from some of these different groups who were included in this launch event. So, we had, of course, begun sharing the podcast in the community with some of the different networks that were involved in Urban Core, but some of the others too. We created these little brochures that are sort of listener guides that we had been kind of handing out at different places in the community. But we also had reached out to, I think, all of the researchers whose work we cited in the podcast. Thanks to Maddie for being so diligent about sending all those emails. But it was, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but it was really surprising and encouraging to see just generally kind of level of enthusiasm from researchers. And I think what that highlighted for me too, it reminded me of is that in the sort of context that we are doing this podcast of like the sort of history of extractive research, that it really, in a lot of respects, is these systems that are not set up for success that I think are frustrating to researchers too. Most researchers, I want to believe, and I think this is true, that work in the community or in a community setting really do intend and want their work to be done in a way that sort of adheres to community expectations and also has a real benefit. And so, but I think the way that for-profit publishing and promotion and tenure kind of happen in universities, that kind of engagement with community isn't prioritized, and it can be difficult for researchers to make that a priority in the context of their other responsibilities. So that's not to let anybody like off the hook per se, but I just think it's really interesting to think at a higher level about why we have this system that I don't think a lot of people are happy with on every stage of the way.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't think I don't know which parts of the podcast we edited out in the end, but I feel like we really didn't let like researchers off the hook a lot of the time. And so it was nice to that people were still interested in, like, not that we like really vilified anyone, I don't think, but we didn't take like the most positive approach in some ways to research, I think, at points in the podcast. And it was cool that researchers still wanted to show up. And I like that point, that it's often like not the people, it's often the system.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, like that just the system of academia that in the timelines really don't allow for relationship building. And I feel like that is such a problem because whether it's like the turnover is really high or, grant funding is often by like pilot project, or it's like a limited time frame for projects, and how projects always want to, like, granting agencies often want to see newness instead of like a longitudinal relationships are often not prioritized, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a hard system for researchers to work in. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
And I think that ties back around sort of to what we were saying about our process for making that, and that sort of our relationship as kind of co-hosts and collaborators on this project was really important to being able to kind of get to that certain point with vulnerability and just have these really honest conversations about how we would talk about certain sometimes challenging issues. So I think that's also reflected in our approach. Like it's been more than a year since you first applied to the learning exchange for that work learn position. And I think that time that all of those meetings were really important in us kind of getting to that stage of being able to do this in a good way. Yeah,
every coffee chat mm-hmm. was incredibly essential for us. We had a lot of fun in the process
yes.
too. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had a favorite part of making this podcast that you want to talk about.
I think getting the time to read, like, making this podcast really meant that I spent like all of May of this past year just reading. Like I don't know if you remember this, I like sent you an email. I was like, I'm going to go on a bike trip. And I just went on this little bike trip camping by myself and went to the library every day on the Gulf Islands and would like read all day. And that's something that I find in med school, they don't set aside time for you to take solo bike trips and read, which is quite weird. But in all seriousness, like I think like we're given so much information to learn, but we're not given the time to read about, I think, some things that like really matter. to health and wellness and in learning like Western medicine. Like I think I never would have learned all of these things about housing and employment and the opioid toxicity crisis that I learned through just like sitting down and reading other people's work. And it's interesting because like we're really encouraged to do our own research in this flex period that we're given. But if you're not even like given time to read other people's work, I don't know, it's just a very like individualistic mindset, I think, to think that you need to be constantly producing. And when there's like so much work out there already. And so I guess it's like kind of, I really liked how the project kind of like made me slow down and kind of learn about what other people are doing before kind of like jumping into doing my own research, which I think is essential too in the context of like an extractive research relationship between the academy and the community, that, and what you're talking about earlier, like in the interest of not repeating studies and overburdening community with research, you want to do as much work yourself as you can before coming into a space as a researcher. So I guess that like just having the time to read and think about in these like really important aspects of health relating specifically to Vancouver that really aren't taught in med school. Yeah, I feel like I can be really the curriculum, but I mean I love UBC Med, but yeah, I think like it's never perfect and there's so many things that I wish were taught more.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying too, like really highlights how there's this gap in knowledge translation as well. You know, so you kind of within the context of your program, even if there are sort of gaps and maybe not enough opportunities to kind of do what you did, which is really spend a lot of dedicated time reading through academic articles. Not everyone's going to have that opportunity. Most people probably don't, and so it kind of connects back to, again, why we made the podcast in the first place, is offering another way to engage with all of those things, and that's, you know, more accessible to community members and busy professionals and all kinds of folks. So yeah,
I'm really hoping that someone will pick up this like podcast idea and do it as a flex project again, and so that I can just like listen to the episodes and not make them, but still like stay caught up with the research, because it is so time consuming. And yeah, I don't know how like anyone can expect to keep up with the literature being produced, even just about like one topic in 1 year. Yeah, it's like totally overwhelming. But did you have a favorite? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It just made me think about how we were talking about, what topics we'd want to address. But to some extent, I think even just revisiting those topics a year later, there would be tons that we could talk about for the topics that we had covered in the first kind of round of episodes. But, you know. Yeah.
Did you have a favorite part of making the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting was sort of like, as you mentioned, sort of work through this process of scripting, which is really important when we're talking about when we're kind of trying to figure out the best way to talk about either sensitive issues or complex issues in an accessible way, to be very thoughtful about that. But also we would, Matt mentioned this before, we would kind of like sort of record through the script and get, you know, a good take, but also allow ourselves just to kind of talk about what we had just said and then sort of edit together some of the reflections that are sort of happening in the moment as we were recording the episode. And I think we got more confident with that as we went. And some of those conversations where we're able to kind of get a bit deeper and be a little bit more responsive to what the other person was saying and how we were starting to think about some of these issues was really cool to see the way we were able to kind of have a bit of a balance between structure and also enough flexibility that we could kind of include those reflections and pieces in the episodes.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning, like I would script us down to like, okay, Nick, now you say, wow. And like, it'd be like, I would say something and then it would be like, oh, no, not wow. How about you say, whoa-ha, like it was down to this like absurd level of scripting. And I think by the end we were just a lot more comfortable. And we could go off script at least for like the exclamations. And
Yeah.
it would just, yeah, I feel like I don't know. And I would say like, okay, Nick, I'm not going to script this one as much. Like, I'm going to be really chill. I'm going to be really chill. And then we'd get there and I'd have like a 20-page document of, you know, our script for the day. But I agree with you. Like I think the best moments of the podcast are the pieces that we edited together afterwards that were just, we like left the recording on and just would chat. I mean, there were a lot of bloopers too. Like there's a lot that I'm glad we didn't end up including in the podcast, but yeah.
We had that space to sort of make mistakes and be vulnerable and sort of trust that we would come to something we were both like happy with putting out later. But it was an important part of the process, and I think I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, me too. It was really fun. I'm wondering if there's any like questions in the chat. I feel like we've spent a lot of time.
Yeah, we have tons of questions. Did you want to hop right into them?
Yeah? Sure. Okay, sounds good.
We have this question. It says, when researching each episode, was there anything you found that really surprised you and changed the trajectory of how you thought the episode might go, and or change or challenge bias you might have realized that you had going on?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think.
This isn't so much like a piece of the research findings, but I know those episodes about substance use and like harm reduction and safe supply, I think we needed to really unpack a lot around, you know, I think oftentimes in research, there's a lot of assumptions made about, so, you know, what are kind of acceptable uses for substances, for example, or that, you know, we can have empathy if somebody is using substances in response to trauma, but not be empathetic if somebody is using it for recreation or to relax or whatever their other reasons might be. And so kind of separating out and kind of putting a fine line on that sort of like, doesn't really matter why somebody's using substances. They shouldn't be at risk of being poisoned because of that, and really putting a fine point on that and making sure that we would kind of unpack when we found those sort of assumptions baked into a lot of the research, because they would kind of start from certain positions like that, sort of revealing their own kind of perspective or some of those baked in biases that, like, you know, certainly I've held at certain times as well. And I think it caused at least me to sort of really challenge those, even when I wasn't aware of those kind of biases existing. So that was one example, I think, for me.
I think that's a good example. Like, I remember reading one study, and I said something to you like, oh, this, you know, they found success with X percentage of participants, and you were like, okay, but like, what was success defined as? And then we're kind of digging back through, and success was defined as a reduction in drug use. And we're like, okay, who's defining this success, right? Like, is this the participant saying, okay, my goal is to reduce my substance use because of XYZ. How can I do that? Or is this like the researchers saying, we are going to try to reduce the participants' substance use because that is what we think of as success. So I think that, like, yeah, it was just so baked into the studies of what, even just looking at the definition of a positive outcome. I think that's especially interesting with safe supply and those topics, because, you know, really, and I mean, it just comes back to like, if you believe everyone deserves to live, then your goal should be to keep people alive. And then I think there were so many clear examples in that where, like, it felt like some studies, okay, the goal here doesn't actually look like it's to keep people alive, and like feels like a really big ethical issue. So I feel like we had a lot of conversations about that. And I think the safe supply episodes were probably the ones where I learned the most. Like, I think I went into making those episodes, like now reflecting back, like I don't think I understood what safe supply was. And I don't think I understood how like solid the research was around safe supply, and how like dramatic, how, I don't know, how clear the right path forward is. I think I kind of, yeah, I didn't understand, I think what, or making this episodes really shaped, I guess, my opinions about safe supply, at least like in Vancouver, and how like I really feel now like there's kind of one ethical option going forward, and that's like providing safe supply. And I think like every day that we don't do that in the city, like it's an active choice, because we can do it. And there's people like the Drug User Liberation Front, really risking a lot, like personally and professionally, and risking jail time to be distributing safe drugs in a compassion club model, when like we know, like I think it was a 2017 or 2019 article that the BCCSU put out about actually advocating for heroin compassion clubs as like an ethical way to save like innumerable lives. And still we don't have the legislation and the infrastructure to be to do that. And it's really coming down to like all the burden is landing on drug user activists. And not only are they doing all the work, they're like assuming all of the risk. And yeah, I guess I just didn't realize, and I like came away from those podcasts just feeling like really strongly in a way, I guess, that I didn't feel before, about the importance of safe supply.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like about, I think, ultimately like respecting the dignity and like human rights of people who use substances, and focusing on that first and foremost, like you said, like keeping people alive and doing what you can to support them, even if you don't agree with their choices, whatever your perspective might be. And certainly, like you said, if somebody is wanting to change their relationship to the substances that they're using, like it's there's value in supporting them to do that, but when it's at their sort of discretion, and that's their part of their autonomy to make that choice, or they may choose to continue to using substances, and we should support them to do that in a safe way, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of, I think we talked about this on pod too. Eris Nix like came and gave this wonderful talk last year to a group of med students. And in it, she was describing how like the medical profession kind of tells patients what is, like defines what wholeness is, and then defines what a lack of wholeness is. And I think that's like a big problem that I see in the way that we're learning medicine, is like we define what disease is and we define what wellness is, and for our patients, instead of like the other way around. Like I think especially with drug use, like you need to ask someone, you need someone to tell you what is a healthy state for them and what is not. Like you can never like tell someone else what health is or should mean to them. And I'm not summarizing that well, but I think we link Eris's talk in one of the episodes. But yeah, it was just like transformative for me in my thinking around I guess who gets to define what health is. And it has to be, you have to define what health is for yourself, and that includes substance use. So
Yeah, I feel like it's like humanizing it and making it like we have a relationship with prescription drugs and stuff, but we don't have a relationship with illicit drugs. So it's like, how are we going to coexist with living with both? Because it's not like they're going to magically disappear and we're going to be like, okay, like let's live a life without it. So yeah, I definitely get what you're trying to say, or what you said. And we'll get the next question to you. Can you define approaching well-being in a nation-based lens?
um I'm not sure. I can try to answer. I'm not exactly sure what the question is getting at. I don't know if okay, well let me know, whoever asked the question, let me know if this answers it. But I guess that kind of brings up for me the idea of that wellness is cultural, and that wellness is like not only like person specific but community specific, and that wellness exists at like various levels of the individual and the community and nation. And that, I guess, it brings to mind the idea of like, especially in BC, where we have, you know, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people both living in urban centers and on traditional territories. Like we can't take a generalized approach to wellness, and that we have to be really looking to all the individual features of a person, a community, et cetera, that are going to define for themselves what wellness is. But I don't know if I'm answering the question. I feel like that's very vague. Do you have any thoughts on that, Serene?
I'm just gonna look at the question again. So the question said, can you define approaching well-being in a nations-based lens? I feel like from a nations-based lens, like that's like well-being can be defined by each person individually, or like by communities and stuff. And it can be hard to interpret that in each community, just because each community may have like their own wellness and well-being in their own lens and whatnot. So I feel like it's it can be more centered around how that community sees it or whatnot. So like finding out, like, nation-based can be very specific, like to like what nation are we talking about? Like, are we talking about from your nation, Maddie? Like are you speaking from your perspective? Am I speaking from my perspective? Like, well-being to me would be like a healthy family and a healthy community, and that can be living well with one another, you know, like it can be defined. That's my interpretation of like well-being from my nation-based background, which could be a little bit different from yours and also Nick's. Like so that's kind of my interpretation on it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. And I wonder if that like doesn't answer the question, maybe we could have follow-up questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Let us know if that didn't answer.
Mm-hmm. Our next question is, would you recommend learning about the Downtown Eastside without physically being there, or is it even possible?
I might be able to answer that question. I think that if I can speak to sort of the learning exchanges approach to, we often either introduce or reintroduce UBC students to the Downtown Eastside in a number of different ways. I think we are constantly aware of avoiding sort of tourism into the community. It's really important to remember that like this is where people live, and you know, inviting students, especially in large numbers, in can be very disrespectful. And so, and again, also kind of like couching this in the perspective of like, I don't live in the Downtown Eastside either. And so I don't want to imply that I'm speaking on behalf of any or all the people who live there. But one thing we've really worked on is sort of creating resources to provide some education about the Downtown Eastside to people who are not from the Downtown Eastside. We have a series of videos shifting the story that are available to UBC staff and faculty and students through Kaltura, which is sort of like an internal video platform that provide community member perspectives on their community. Aside from this podcast, we've also worked with a student to create a series of podcasts that reflects at least 3 of perspectives from 3 of the different communities that contribute to making up the Downtown Eastside as a whole. So we spoke with somebody from the Chinese community and someone from the Black community, someone who supports sex workers in the Downtown Eastside. And that's also sort of illustrating, that podcast is called Communities Within a Community, and sort of reflects the diversity of perspectives and experiences and histories of the Downtown Eastside. So, we have created a lot of these resources that are really intended to help people kind of like self-educate about the community. We also support doing orientations about the Downtown Eastside, sharing other materials that have been created by Downtown Eastside community members, specifically about how they would like to be represented. We also have worked with community organizations and community members to create a series of neighborhood walks that are intended for people to go in groups of 2 or 3, perhaps after having engaged with some of these other materials first, to kind of gain a bit of perspective about an asset-based approach to working with the Downtown Eastside community or learning about it. And if folks are interested in doing those walks, we can arrange sort of a pre-brief and debrief. The walks have been arranged in consultation with those organizations and people in the community to really, again, highlight some of the assets around different kinds of themes. So we have like a health-focused walk, a cultural walk, a number of different things like that, that really do provide that sort of opportunity to kind of learn about the Downtown Eastside in a more kind of place-based, kind of embodied way. So yeah, I think it's just we take a lot of care, I think, to at the Learning Exchange anyway. Like, we're not gatekeepers of this community by any means, but certainly to try to facilitate opportunities to learn about the Downtown Eastside in a way that, again, reflects kind of what we've heard from community members about how they would like people to learn about and engage with their community.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, following up on the nations-based question, what strategies did you use in the podcast to avoid generalizing Indigenous peoples when research and medicine in general tend to generalize populations? Was the podcast as a medium helpful for this, or how so?
That's such a good question. I have to think about that a bit. Yeah, wait, I'm gonna pull up the question so I can see. Let's see. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think it's tough because I guess coming from my perspective, coming to the podcast, I'm biased, like, identifies First Nations, and so like I think that's kind of, I'm already focusing like, we weren't in any way trying to cover topics. We weren't trying to like broadly cover the experience of like all Indigenous people in BC, and it wasn't even I guess out of the gate like attempting to be a podcast about even Indigenous health in general. So I think in some ways it kind of, like, the ways in which we did talk about Indigenous health, I think, came from kind of me like inserting myself in what I cared about and the research that stuck out to me, which I think inherently meant we focused more on research relating to First Nations in BC. And then I think the question about generalizing, though, is so good because I find it's an interesting balance, and I don't have like any of this figured out, but when talking about Indigenous health in an urban context where people are often like geographically or culturally separated from their communities, I think it's really interesting because you'll see programs come up about connecting people to culture as a protective factor, which I think is so important. But it begs the question of like, what culture? Like, are you, like, I identify as Indigenous, but I'm not Indigenous to the Lower Mainland. Like Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish culture is not like my culture. So then if you're hosting like cultural events here, how do you honor the land you're on, and also the land that everyone is coming from and everyone is Indigenous to? So I think it's like really complex. And then if you have these programs that, if you're trying to like, I don't know, I guess I think it's really complex and I don't have a good answer. But I think we in translating research about Indigenous peoples done in BC, we're definitely like aware of that problem of like a lot of research generalizes across like First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, like let alone, generalizing across nations. Like it's like so many levels of generalization. And then it's hard because you want to see Indigenous peoples represented in research, but you want to see it done in a certain way, and you want to see like it done well. And so then, sorry, that's not a great answer, but I guess that's what comes to mind for me.
If I can just talk for a second too about like, I think even just our perspective in the title too, like everything is health, like there are so many factors that are individualized and relevant to that particular person. And as Maddie mentioned before, your community and social context and cultural context. So I think in terms of the podcast, are kind of, and again, I feel like I keep coming back to this, but are sort of like being very upfront and kind of like reflective on our own positionality and perspective, and not sort of claiming to speak for more than that. And, I think in certain cases too, like where we've sort of interrogated some of the methods and assumptions that have gone into research that can often be presented as being authoritative and sort of, I don't know, bulletproof and generalizable. It's like, I think it's a tough thing to grapple with for sure. But I think to some extent, like how we've tried to position ourselves and frame the whole podcast in a way, I think reflects us sort of trying to think about that and being really intentional and careful.
But I'm sure like some of the studies that we talked about were studies in which they would generalize, or, like even just like overtly generalize, like say things like Indigenous people included in this study, or like, and not even like break it down further than that, or not talk about nationhood or anything like that. But then it's hard because it's like, do you not translate those studies because of these flaws? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it can be kind of hard to define some things, because then you kind of lose a little bit of aspects of like in your research, like when you're doing research for Indigenous health, like it's a little bit more like you have the 3 pillars, like, and then you can go from there, compared to like just doing health in general, like, which is like really broad. But yeah. Our next question is, do you have advice for those beginning the process of learning how to host a podcast?
Nick, do you want to tackle this one? I feel like you hit a lot of, for coming from your music background, I feel like you were really an important support in getting the podcast up.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe to some extent, having that background made it easier for us to kind of navigate how to prepare to do this, or for me to figure out sort of like, okay, Maddie you haven't done something like this before. Here's some resources or things that'll be helpful for you to learn, so we can do this well. There are quite a few really good, I think, just learning resources out there about podcasting. I think often the public library offers workshops about kind of working through the whole process. I think we really thought carefully about like what we had, aside from the technical aspects, like what we wanted to say with this podcast and what we wanted the tone to be and what kind of our audience we were aiming for was, and having some having some good conversations to establish that before we even kind of started thinking about the details of the format and the technical aspects was really helpful. Yeah, I mean, it's really helpful to have a good microphone, and you can get some really good free recording software. Audacity is really easy to work with and is open source free software. In terms of actually recording, I know UBC has some spaces. We actually recorded this podcast at the DIY Media Studio in the Irving K. Barber Learning Center, which is a space that students and faculty and staff at UBC can book. Again, thinking about the Vancouver context, I know Vancouver Public Library also has some recording studio spaces that you can book at the Central Branch and the Nuts and Nuts Strathcona Branch. So I think there are some of those spaces and resources you can draw on to. You don't need to like have your own equipment. The staff at those spaces is really helpful in terms of offering guidance about how to use the equipment and that kind of thing. And then in terms of like distributing the podcast, we did that through anchor.fm, which is sort of a free like Spotify affiliate that you can use to send the podcast to Spotify. And then from there, like link to other sort of distribution channels. So that was another thing that kind of we were able to make use of. But aside from kind of the time that we put into preparing and recording and producing the episodes, we didn't need to purchase any software or equipment or anything because we were able to make use of those options that were sort of already available out there. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of details that go into kind of making it, but certainly if like anybody listening wants to chat about that or send any specific questions, I'm happy to meet or talk about that some other time and get into some of the details.
Yeah, we actually wrote up like a step-by-step of how we did it, because there were so many like little things, just figuring out like what software to use and stuff. I loved Audacity, and it really supported me all the way through getting like obsessive about like editing out breath sounds, and like we got like a little too far into it, but it was really easy to use. And I would definitely, and like that's what the Chapman Learning Commons uses to record, and so that was just like so easy to not have to switch between platforms. But I wonder, yeah, I think we'll, if anyone like has any questions about it, we can even send over that step-by-step guide thing we made.
Definitely.
To follow up the podcast question, what does the process look like for allies that are helping out as a co-host on Indigenous-led podcast on Indigenous health? Can you talk more about the process of scripting?
So I can answer the first question to start with. I guess I think there's like two pieces there. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly like working on this podcast with Maddie, I think it was really important for me to do a lot of reflecting and thinking about sort of my positionality and sort of the supportive role I might be able to play in helping Maddie make this podcast, where it was a good fit for me to provide that support, but other places where it was like so important for Maddie to be taking the lead and me to be kind of taking a backseat, or yeah, just trying to be really thoughtful about that. But I also think that, again, just to kind of come back to establishing like a strong relationship between the two of us enabled me to have that kind of supportive role in the way that sort of, I mean, not to speak on Maddie's behalf, but I would hope that was like supportive and helpful for Maddie, and that would be different working, that would look different working with somebody else, I think. And so, yeah, probably there's no like one size, like I feel like we're just circulating around a lot of themes here, which is great too, but there's not, you know, one way to be an ally. I think like the context and the relationship you have with, in this case, like the communities that we're sort of talking about, but also like with the person that you're potentially working with, that all is critical, I think. I don't know, Maddie, if you have anything you would want to say from your perspective on that question.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. Thanks for putting Nick on the spot like that. What I like to do as well. Um, I think, yeah, just like what came to mind for me was this one time, it was like so early on in our process. And we had this meeting with someone and they were like, they started really questioning. I was like kind of telling them what wanted to see the podcast. And they were like really questioning. They basically were like, well, I don't think you should talk about Indigenous health, like something like that. Like it just came, like they were questioning how we were going to talk about issues relating to Indigenous health. And they started telling me about how it would be like, this is my recollection too. I have a bad habit of dramatizing stories in my mind. So with a grain of salt, they started telling me how like we shouldn't talk about residential schools because residential schools are this like complex issue. And obviously like I present as white. And so like I sometimes get in these situations where, like people obviously don't assume I'm Indigenous. And I like said to them, we're on this call, there's probably like Nick and like one other person too. And like I remember like kind of like opening up to them as a way of like diffusing the situation, I guess, and saying like, oh, like, well, I like would be talking about this from like a personal angle. And like, this is kind of like, and we hadn't, and I realized in that process too, and I remember talking about this after, like, we hadn't started off the meeting with like introducing ourselves and our positionality, which I think like that's something I would usually have done and just slipped my mind. But it was a really good example to me of like how like the consequences of not knowing where everyone you're meeting with is coming from. But anyway, in this moment, like I think that was like a tough moment for me. Like it felt very like vulnerable to like be sharing about my family in like what felt like kind of a confrontation to begin with. And I remember like, well, first of all, I think Nick like in the moment was like very supportive. And then afterwards, we like probably had known each other for like a week or something at this point. Nick like reached out and we had like a debrief about it and like was just like so there for me. I think that like set like I think there was like moments like that, I guess, in like building our relationship where I felt that gave me more confidence like in our ability to do this project together. Because I think without like our relationship, like we couldn't have done it because we did have like, I don't know, it's just like we we're talking about tough stuff. And so it like required, I think, a lot of both of us and kind of trying to figure out like how we were going to be like allies to each other and to striving to be allies to the communities that we were talking about as well. It's just like, yeah, it took a lot of intentional work and definitely, I think like a lot of talking, a lot of communication.
On that note, how did you navigate the balance between keeping things conversational but also creating thoughtful scripts for each episode?
So I could talk a little bit about the process. So we kind of started with like, I think, so we've been having, many conversations about kind of generally what we wanted to cover. And Maddie had been sharing some of the sources that she was looking at. But then we'd sort of start from like, Maddie would kind of like send me an initial script and we would go through like several rounds of like editing it, either just like reading it through, but also like practicing it to see like what felt unnatural or what felt like, oh, we could add a bit more here, kind of adding in more of my perspective in certain places as well. And sort of having that as like the basis for a particular episode. But again, increasingly as we went on, having more of those opportunities to just kind of like keep the microphones on and recording and just sort of with the idea that like either of us could kind of just like sort of go off script and we would just have a conversation and record it and then think about whether that would be something that would be beneficial or relevant to include. So there's also that kind of, there's those moments that are like definitely unscripted and then ones that are kind of like still sticking more or less to kind of what we had written down. But yeah, just making sure that it through that process of practicing and revising it, making it really feeling really lived in and like kind of from our own voices as well. But yeah, really have Maddie to thank for kind of drafting up those scripts to get us started and oriented towards what we wanted to cover.
Thank you for that. And we have one last question. If you do If you did additional episodes, might you have broadened the scope to other communities across BC?
I don't know. I think like I think it's really important to me to be like doing stuff that relates to like doing projects in like a place-based way. Like I think that's I think what interests me about a lot of Indigenous health research is that like indigeneity is inherently tied to place, and you can't like talk about that you can't talk about indigeneity without talking about the place that that indigeneity is relative to. And I guess like that's kind of a tenet for me of like when I think about getting involved in a project, like does it feel grounded in where you're coming from, I guess. And so I think I liked this project because Nick and I both live in Vancouver, we're both affiliated with UBC, and the Downtown Eastside makes sense as a community to talk about because of the extractive research history, and also because of Nick's position as working as this librarian, kind of trying to bridge UBC and the Downtown Eastside communities. And so I think like it kind of was the only one of the only like communities that kind of made sense to talk about. Like I don't think that we could talk about things going on outside of Vancouver because it's just not, it would be too far out of our wheelhouse. But that'd be my take on it.
Thank you. Thank you to all, that was our last question. So thank you to all our guests and to everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Maddie and Nick, for the amazing discussion. It was great to learn about which episodes were your favorite, what part of the process was the most fun to do, and just learning about more about the podcast and how it's really impacted your guys' lives, and like how grateful it's been a great resource for yourself and for creating it for other people. And yeah, so just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming learning circle. We have First Peoples Cultural Council that's on January 26th at 10 a.m. And then we have Unlearning and Undoing Systemic White Supremacy and Indigenous Specific Racism that's on February 7th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we have Indigenous Health Administration and Leadership Program that's on February 16th at 10 a.m. And you can sign up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All the webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next learning circle. Lim Lim, thank you.